let's continue covering in depth the fascinating North American exploits of Count Frontenac and New France under the Sun King Louis XIV.
Count Frontenac and Perrot, 1673 to 1675. Not long before Governor Frontenac's arrival, Courcelles, his predecessor, went to Lake Ontario with an armed force, in order to impose respect on the Iroquois. As a means of keeping them in check and at the same time controlling the fur trade of the upper country, he had recommended, like Talon before him, the building of a fort near the outlet of the lake. Frontenac at once saw the advantages of such a measure, and his desire to execute it was stimulated by the reflection that the proposed fort might be made not only a safeguard to the colony, but also a sort of profit to himself. At Quebec there was a grave, thoughtful, self-contained young man, who soon found his way into Frontenac's confidence. There was between them the sympathetic attraction of two bold and energetic spirits, and though Cavalier de la Salle had neither the irritable vanity of the Count nor his Gallic vivacity of passion, he had in full measure the same unconquerable pride and hardy resolution. There were but 2 or 3 men in Canada who knew the western wilderness so well. He was full of schemes of ambition and of gain, and from this moment he and Frontenac seemed to have formed an alliance which ended only with the governor's recall. In telling the story of La Salle, I have described the execution of the new plan, the muster of the Canadians at the call of Frontenac, the consternation of those of the merchants whom he and La Salle had not taken into their councils, and who saw in the movement the preparation for a gigantic fur-trading monopoly, the intrigues set on foot to bar the enterprise, the advance up the St. Lawrence, the assembly of Iroquois at the destined spot, the ascendancy exercised over them by the governor, the building of Fort Frontenac on the ground where Kingston now stands, and its final transfer into the hands of La Salle on condition, there can be no doubt, of sharing the expected profits with his patron. On the way to the lake, Frontenac stopped for some time at Montreal, where he had full opportunity to become acquainted with the state of things to which his attention had already been directed. This state of things was as follows. When the Intendant Talon came for the second time to Canada in 1669, an officer named Perrot, who had married his niece, came with him. Perrot, anxious to turn to account the influence of his wife's relative, looked about him for some post of honor and profit, and quickly discovered that the government of Montreal was vacant. The priests of Saint-Sulpice, feudal owners of the place, had the right of appointing their own governor. Talon advised them to choose Perrot, who thereupon received the desired commission, which, however, was revocable at the will of those who had granted it. The new governor, therefore, begged another commission from the king, and after a little delay he obtained it. Thus he became in some measure independent of the priests who, if they wished to rid themselves of him, must first gain the royal consent. Perrot, as he had doubtless foreseen, found himself in an excellent position for making money. The tribes of the upper lakes and all the neighboring regions brought down their furs every summer to the annual fair at Montreal. Perrot took his measures accordingly. On the island which still bears his name, lying above Montreal and directly in the route of the descending Indians, he built a storehouse, and placed it in charge of a retired lieutenant named Bussy, who stopped the Indians on their way, and carried on an active trade with them to the great profit of himself and his associate, and the great loss of the merchants in the settlements below. This was not all. Perrot connived at the desertion of his own soldiers, who escaped to the woods, became coureurs de bois, or bushrangers, traded with the Indians in their villages, and shared their gains with their commander. Many others, too, of these forest rovers, outlawed by royal edicts, found in the governor of Montreal a protector, under similar conditions. The journey from Quebec to Montreal often consumed a fortnight. Perrot thought himself virtually independent, and relying on his commission from the king, the protection of Talon, and his connection with other persons of influence, he felt safe in his position and began to play the petty tyrant. The judge of Montreal and several of the chief inhabitants came to offer a humble remonstrance against disorders committed by some of the ruffians in his interest. Perrot received them with a storm of vituperation, and presently sent the judge to prison. This proceeding was followed by a series of others closely akin to it, so that the priests of Saint-Sulpice, who received their full share of official abuse, began to repent bitterly of the governor they had chosen. Frontenac had received stringent orders from the king to arrest all the bushrangers, or coureurs de bois, but since he had scarcely a soldier at his disposal, except his own bodyguard, the order was difficult to execute. As, however, most of these outlaws were in the service of his rival Perrot, his zeal to capture them rose high against every obstacle. He had, moreover, a plan of his own in regard to them, and had already petitioned the minister for a galley, to the benches of which the captive bushrangers were to be chained as rowers, thus supplying the representative of the king with a means of transportation befitting his dignity, and at the same time giving wholesome warning against the infraction of royal edicts. Accordingly, he sent orders to the judge at Montreal to seize every coureur de bois on whom he could lay hands. The judge, hearing that 2 of the most notorious were lodged in the house of a lieutenant named Carillon, sent a constable to arrest them, whereupon Carillon threatened and maltreated the officer of justice and helped the men to escape. Perrot took the part of his lieutenant and told the judge that he would put him in prison in spite of Frontenac if he ever dared to attempt such an arrest again. When Frontenac heard what had happened, his ire was doubly kindled. On the one hand, Perrot had violated the authority lodged by the king in the person of his representative, and on the other, the mutinous official was a rival in trade who had made great and illicit profits, while his superior had thus far made none. As a governor and as a man, Frontenac was deeply moved. Yet, helpless as he was, he could do no more than send 3 of his guardsmen under a lieutenant named Bizarre, with orders to arrest Carillon and bring him to Quebec. The commission was delicate. The arrest was to be made in the dominions of Perrot, who had the means to prevent it, and the audacity to use them. Bizarre acted accordingly. He went to Carillon's house and took him prisoner, then proceeded to the house of the merchant Lebert, where he left a letter in which Frontenac, as was the usage on such occasions, gave notice to the local governor of the arrest he had ordered. It was the object of Bizarre to escape with his prisoner before Perrot could receive the letter. But meanwhile, the wife of Carillon ran to him with the news, and the governor suddenly arrived in a frenzy of rage, followed by a sergeant and 3 or 4 soldiers. The sergeant held the point of his halberd against the breast of Bizarre, while Perrot, choking with passion, demanded, "How dare you arrest an officer in my government without my leave?" The lieutenant replied that he acted under orders of the governor-general, and gave Frontenac's letter to Perrot, who immediately threw it into his face, exclaiming, "Take it back to your master and tell him to teach you your business better another time. Meanwhile you are my prisoner." Bizarre protested in vain. He was led to jail, whither he was followed a few days after by Lebert, who had mortally offended Perrot by signing an attestation of the scene he had witnessed. As he was the chief merchant of the place, his arrest produced a great sensation, while his wife presently took to her bed with a nervous fever. As Perrot's anger cooled, he became somewhat alarmed. He had resisted the royal authority and insulted its representative. The consequences might be serious. Yet he could not bring himself to retrace his steps. He merely released Bizarre and sullenly permitted him to depart, with a letter to the governor-general more impertinent than apologetic. Frontenac, as his enemies declare, was accustomed, when enraged, to foam at the mouth. Perhaps he did so when he learned the behavior of Perrot. If he had had at command a few companies of soldiers, there can be little doubt that he would have gone at once to Montreal, seized the offender and brought him back in irons. But his bodyguard of 20 men was not equal to such an enterprise. Nor would a muster of the militia have served his purpose, for the settlers about Quebec were chiefly peaceful peasants, while the denizens of Montreal were disbanded soldiers, fur traders, and forest adventurers, the best fighters in Canada. They were nearly all in the interest of Perrot, who, if attacked, had the temper as well as the ability to make a passionate resistance. Thus civil war would have ensued, and the anger of the king would have fallen on both parties. On the other hand, if Perrot were left unpunished, the coureurs de bois of whom he was the patron would set no bounds to their audacity, and Frontenac, who had been ordered to suppress them, would be condemned as negligent or incapable. Among the priests of Saint-Sulpice at Montreal was the Abbé Salignac de Fénelon, half-brother of the celebrated author of Télémaque. He was a zealous missionary, enthusiastic and impulsive, still young, and more ardent than discreet. One of his uncles had been the companion of Frontenac during the Canadian War, and hence the Count's relations with the missionary had been very friendly. Frontenac now wrote to Perrot directing him to come to Quebec and give account of his conduct. And he coupled this letter with another to Fénelon, urging him to represent to the offending governor the danger of his position, and advise him to seek an interview with his superior, by which the difficulty might be amicably adjusted. Perrot, dreading the displeasure of the king, soothed by the moderate tone of Frontenac's letter, and moved by the assurances of the enthusiastic abbé, who was delighted to play the part of peacemaker, at length resolved to follow his counsel. It was midwinter. Perrot and Fenelon set out together, walked on snowshoes 180 miles down the frozen St. Lawrence, and made their appearance before the offended count. Frontenac, there can be little doubt, had never intended that Perrot, once in his power, should return to Montreal as its governor, but that, beyond this, he meant harm to him, there is not the least proof. Perrot, however, was as choleric and stubborn as the count himself, and his natural disposition had not been improved by several years of petty autocracy at Montreal. Their interview was brief, but stormy. When it ended, Perrot was a prisoner in the chateau, with guards placed over him by day and night. Frontenac made choice of one Lanougère, a retired officer whom he knew that he could trust, and sent him to Montreal to command in place of its captive governor. With him he also sent a judge of his own selection. Lanougère set himself to his work with vigor. Perrot's agent or partner, Brucy, was seized, tried, and imprisoned, and an active hunt was begun for his coureurs de bois. Among others, the two who had been the occasion of the dispute were captured and sent to Quebec, where one of them was solemnly hanged before the window of Perrot's prison, with the view, no doubt, of producing a chastening effect on the mind of the prisoner. The execution was fully authorized, a royal edict having ordained that bushranging was an offense punishable with death. As the result of these proceedings, Frontenac reported to the minister that only 5 coureurs de bois remained at large, all the rest having returned to the settlements and made their submission, so that farther hanging was needless. Thus the central power was vindicated, and Montreal brought down from her attitude of partial independence.